Sometimes I like to start these out by asking a question. So my question to you is, what kind of deity murders his fellow gods, steals their portfolios, and writes a book so insane that it drives the reader mad? Well, today we study perhaps the most dangerous deity to ever walk the material plane. He's known as the Prince of Lies, the mad god himself, Cyric. Cyric was born a mortal in the early 1330s inside the now-destroyed city of Candlekeep. At the time, it was an immensely powerful city located where the river Tesh meets the Moonsea. With a father acting as a low-ranking officer and his mother an unsuccessful and poor bard, Cyric was certainly not born into any form of wealth or privilege. In fact, his father would actually refuse to even acknowledge Cyric's mere existence. His mother would be forced to resort to prostitution to simply make ends meet, which perhaps nobly she did, until the day she was slain by Cyric's father. With all of this clearly setting Cyric up for a deeply troubled childhood, life would continue to worsen when he was sold into slavery by his very own father, shipping him off to the nation of Sembia, a young, wealthy country governed by its merchants. He would then be purchased by a wealthy family who would go on to raise him in the lap of luxury, so perhaps life would begin to look up. Well, not really. At the age of 10, Cyric would learn of his origins and subsequently run away from his family's estate. Though he would be returned by authorities, he would go on to talk loudly about how his true home was Candlekeep. This would spread throughout the nobility and due to that, spell disaster for his parents' business. And over time, the mistrust of his parents would fester inside of him and eventually turn into outright hatred towards them. And at the mere age of 12, Cyric would murder his parents and flee for Candlekeep. After fleeing, Cyric would quickly realize that survival on his own was no simple task, and within 10 days find himself at the edge of starvation. And this next part might sound strange, but fortunately the young Cyric would be captured by Zent slavers and taken straight to Candlekeep, his original destination. For better or worse, this would save his life and allow him to survive, if only for a bit longer. He would, however, escape captivity and go on to join the local thieves guild, marking the start of his career as a rogue. As we can see, Cyric is not one to give up. We see his young life full of misery and struggle. Some people come out of that looking to improve the world around them, giving them empathy towards the less fortunate, because at one point they lived that very same life, but not Cyric. Poverty and struggle only seemed to instill a paranoid and selfish mindset. He became someone who would survive at any cost, even if it meant inflicting that very same misery on those around him. And speaking of those around him, it was around this time that Cyric would find himself traveling with a specific band of adventurers. This would include a mercenary by the name of Kelimvor Lionsbane, and a mysterious magic user known as Midnight, among a few others. Each of these companions have their own tales that could be told, but not as a part of this particular entry. And I'm going to compress a good bit of time here, simply because it isn't quite relevant to the topic at hand, but Cyric and his party would go on many adventures across the lands, everything from freeing Mystra from captivity to helping in the defense of Shadowdale, which was being attacked by soldiers from his birthland of Candlekeep. During this time, Cyric would honestly exhibit a range of both positive and negative traits. There are instances where he would act heroically, protecting the lives of those he cared about and standing up for what is right, but also sometimes he would be paranoid or violent. He would even stab his old mentor in the back as he walked away, though I might argue that that particular instance may have been warranted. However, despite all this, Cyric would find his companions blamed for the death of Elminster through no fault of their own, and sentenced to death. He would eventually free his companions from this fate, but in doing so, filled with bloodlust, would go on to slaughter many of the innocent guards. As you can tell, this was a troubled time for Cyric, in a life already full of chaos. But at the time, the realms would also be thrown into chaos. Now, moving forward, there's quite a lot of history, so I'll just try and touch on the important parts. After freeing his companions from certain death, it seemed as though a different Cyric had emerged. No longer was he the conflicted rogue of the past. He had fully embraced his cynicism and a dark nature began to take hold. But as they fled, the party had heard a rumor that an artifact known as the Tablet of Fate was said to lay to the east, so they started to make their way towards it. And I see some of you know exactly what this artifact is, but for those who don't, this is an artifact that belonged to the single most powerful god in our universe, a god named Overlord Ao. And we do have an archived entry or two on Ao, so seek it out when we're done here. But these artifacts, stolen directly from Ao by two other gods, were the reason for the chaos in the world at the time. And if you know your history well, you know exactly what I mean. Because all of this took place during a period known as the Time of Troubles. Now, I've touched on this historical moment in other entries, but as a refresher, the Time of Troubles was a period during which the deities of our world were forced by Lord Ao to walk the land in their mortal avatar forms. And yes, that comes with everything you might expect, including being permanently killed. However, the ones responsible for the theft of the tablets were known as the gods Bane and Merkle. And I won't go into the chronology of the event, not in this particular entry, but as you can imagine, this was the perfect time for a being like Cyric to exist. The amount of chaos and lack of clarity towards the future was the ideal moment for Cyric to use his duplicity to take advantage of the situation. At the time, Cyric had been recruited into Bane's service. However, this wouldn't last long as he would abandon him while Bane was engaged in combat with another god, a god known as Torm. After fleeing the battle, Cyric and those who traveled with him would go on to slaughter an entire halfling village, where he would obtain a special sword known as God's Bane, a sentient blade inhabited by the god Mask, the god of shadows and thievery. How Mask took the form of this blade is, once again, a tale unto itself. Suffice it to say, yeah, it was quite a tumultuous time on Faerun. But after obtaining this incredibly powerful blade, Cyric and his tentative companions fled around the countryside until Midnight found herself captured by the avatar of Baal, the god of murder. To make a long story short, they would engage in combat, but after slaying Baal, Cyric would be incapacitated by the resulting explosion. And upon waking, he would hear Midnight and Kelemvor discussing what should be done with him. After all, he wasn't the same Cyric they had known in the past, not truly. He had turned into some cynical nihilist that was only interested in himself and the acquisition of power. But they decided to leave him to his fate, and unluckily for them, they allowed him to retain God's Bane, the same sword he had used to slay Baal. So Cyric bided his time and tracked his former companions to the great city of Waterdeep, a location you might be familiar with. At the time, his companions were held up in a great tower where they held both of the Tablets of Fate. So this was it. Cyric would go on to slay Kelemvor and gravely wound Midnight, and make off with both of the tablets, intending to return them to Lord Ao and plead his case to the Overgod. As a result, Cyric would indeed be granted godhood, though this would be a hollow victory, because the truth is, Cyric would never again feel any satisfaction or joy, for he had strayed so far from the child yearning to survive and became something more, something dark. He would also have to contend with Midnight, for he never truly killed her, and also because she had been chosen to take on the mantle of the new goddess of magic. So now we reach a key moment. I've illustrated who Cyric was as a child and what kind of environment he was raised in, and I've made the claim that Cyric is uniquely dangerous, uniquely evil in fact. But why him in particular? We've come into contact with gods of the dead, gods of oppression, and hell, the god of murder. So why do I believe Cyric is worse than all of them? Well, to begin, it's clear to me that Cyric exhibits a form of extreme paranoia, which is likely a projection of his inner self. He himself is constantly willing to lie and deceive to attain whatever goal he seeks, so this is projected onto those around him. He believes that many others are just as broken and duplicitous as he is. He has deeply held delusions of grandeur, and while that certainly is quite a negative trait, I don't think that alone would make someone so despicable. But it's more about what these traits exist alongside. Because beyond the delusions, you have an absolutely violent narcissism within Cyric. It's never his fault, it's never something he himself caused. It's always someone else who's in the wrong. And lastly, but perhaps worst of all, the complete and utter willingness to betray even those closest to him if it means just one extra crumb of power for himself. In fact, we can see this exhibited by his followers, who are almost exclusively assassins, cultists, and basically anyone who revels in chaos and confusion. And again, any one of these traits wouldn't put him at the top of the list. It's more so the fact that they exist alongside of each other, and in great abundance. Because Cyric doesn't just want power, he wants the destruction of everyone else, simply because he enjoys it. Okay, let's step away from the history for just a moment. I'd like to touch on one of Cyric's primary artifacts, the Cyrinishad. The Cyrinishad was an unholy tome created by a scribe under the forced divine guidance of Cyric. The tome was made for the sole purpose of increasing Cyric's power, because after the time of troubles, the power of a deity was directly related to the size and devotion of their worshippers. This tome would turn anyone who read it into a radically devout follower of Cyric, thus artificially increasing his power. I say artificially because those who read the book would lose all free will and be unable to willingly stop. In fact, it would even work on another deity should they read it, which makes it, in my opinion, one of the most insanely powerful and insidious artifacts ever devised. And this here speaks to the evil within Cyric. He's willing to essentially enslave the minds of people just to artificially increase his power. But luckily for you and I, the book would eventually be destroyed, but not before Cyric himself would read it. And in doing so, the book would instill an unshakable belief in his own supremacy over the cosmos, and bolster his megalomania to an unheard of degree. But let's move on to Cyric's most consequential act. Enter, once again, Midnight, now in the form of Mystra, the goddess of magic. This section could last for hours, so I'm forced to kind of compress the events of the story, if only to get to the more relevant parts. Suffice it to say, Cyric had held a singular hatred for Mystra. This stemmed from the perceived betrayal he believed he suffered after slaying Baal, so Cyric would lash out at anything and everything the goddess held dear. This would eventually culminate in Cyric briefly allying with Shar, who wanted to take control of magic itself. And since Shar knew that Cyric had held hatred towards Mystra or Midnight, Shar would then convince him to travel to Mystra's home plane and slay her, which Cyric gladly did, viewing it as himself exacting revenge on his former companion and one-time friend. But as you might imagine, Mystra's death would shake the foundation of the weave, and thus magic itself, and it was this action that would ignite the events of the Spellplague, an event so catastrophic that it would change the face of our world. And as punishment, other gods would trap Cyric in his home dimension, the Supreme Throne. Cyric had gone too far, and they would sentence him to captivity for 1,000 years, which carries on to this very day. There is so much more to this tale, but the point of this entry is to illustrate just how uniquely horrible Cyric was, and likely still is. You could compare him to others that I mentioned, Bane who wants dominion, Shar who wants oblivion, among many others. However, each of these gods serve a cosmological purpose whether we like it or not. Because remember, Lord Ao requires balance in all things. For every kind and just god, there is one who is equally destructive and ruinous. Such is the nature of things. But at least to my mind, there's something uniquely malevolent to a being that is entirely convinced of his own supremacy, even over the other beings in the pantheon. Cyric lies, he adores chaos and betrayal. He worships madness and the destruction of everyone else in the name of power. Cyric isn't evil for a greater purpose. He's evil because he loves it. So, remember this lesson well. In a universe filled with demons, devils, and dark gods, the most dangerous one might just be a mad god who believes his own lies. And Cyric believes them all. So there you have it. In my opinion, the most loathsome entity in D&D. Please remember to hit that like and subscribe button if you had a good time, and leave a comment if you have a differing opinion as to who might be the worst. I'll see you guys for the next one, so be safe, take care, and happy trails.